Check. Awesome. All right, guys. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Che Cafe for hosting this teach-in. And today we're going to be talking about the Spanish Civil War. This is going to be hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December of 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. We also host weekly reading groups on Wednesdays from 6 to 8 p.m. and on Thursdays from 5 to 7 p.m. Yeah, 7 p.m. So today I figured that to sort of preface this topic of the Spanish Civil War and anarchism's role and potential possibilities for anarchist organizing, I would preface that with a little bit of the history of anarchism in Spain, because of all the European countries, anarchism probably had the most pronounced presence in Spain compared to the other developed nations. So to give a little bit of background, in the 19th century, you have figures like Ramón de la Sagra, who launched the periodical El Porvenir, or The Future, in 1845, featuring the ideas of Fouillet, Proudhon, and Saint-Simon. So that already sort of put the foot in the door for Spanish anarchism. And then you also have developments such as the Banco Popular, which was formed in 1848 by Ramón de la Sagra and Proudhon to serve as a special bank for the workmen that discounted obligations of commerce. So it sort of meshes with Proudhon's idea of possession as opposed to property, right? To sort of mobilize the social dynamic of possession in the form of credit as opposed to fixed property. And so that was the sort of the revolutionary potential that Proudhon saw in a project like the Banco Popular. Of course, it didn't have a very long legacy. I think a few decades later, it shuttered its doors. But the idea was still there, and there are other figures such as Giuseppe Fanelli, who was dispatched by the Bakuninists to Spain to establish a Spanish section of the First International. So that was the First International before you had the Socialist International, right? And the anarchists were not a part of that Second International. And actually, for instance, Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, tried to go to Spain to establish a workers' party, and he was told by a Catalan statesman that a Marxist political party would never succeed in Spain, interestingly enough. In the Spanish Civil War, that was also true, but for different reasons, more to do with the crisis of revolutionary leadership. We also have figures such as Francisco P. Margal, who was shortly the president of the First Spanish Republic in 1873, who was also influenced by Proudhon. So, those original sort of utopian socialists, anarchists, who were kind of contemporaries of Marx's, were really influential in that foundational period for anarchist politics in Spain. There was also, in 1892, an insurrection in Cadiz, which split the anarchists into two separate factions. So there was the Andalou faction, which was more focused on insurrectionist agrarian organizing. And then there was the Catalan faction, which was more about industrial syndicalism. And if you don't mind, just skip into the next slide. Right here we have El Porvenir. This was the magazine of De la Sagra. This is a depiction of the insurrection in Cadiz. And then this is actually Francisco P. Margal, the first, the president, shortly lived president. I think he stepped down after a day, but anarchist. So, he's in the book. So there's also later on in this period, actually in 1907, so skipping ahead to the 20th century, we have the Labor Federation Solidaridad Obrera, or Workers' Solidarity, which formed in Barcelona on August 3rd, 1907, to unite the various strains of social anarchist organizing that refused to join the UGT, or the Unión General de Trabajadores, or the General Workers Union, which was founded, that union was founded in 1888 under the PSOE, the Partido Socialista Obrero Español, the Workers' Party of Spain, basically, or the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party. Does not have to do with the other Socialist Workers' Party, which we know today. But it's actually still, the major political party in Spain, came back after the dictatorship. But the Solidaridad Obrera played a critical role in the development of anarcho-syndicalism in Spain through its periodical. So I think if we skip to the next one, it will have a little picture. So we can see an issue of Solidaridad Obrera. And you can see it says there's a National Workers' Congress. And so Solidaridad Obrera, in a role similar to what we might see in the Russian Revolution, is a case of an influential paper being a structure for organizing, which is an interesting parallel to draw there. But then also, it goes, the team from Solidaridad Obrera went on to help organize the CNT, which will be the focus of the remainder of this talk, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, or the National Confederation of Workers, or laborers. And then in February of 1919, a strike began in Barcelona in the La Canadiense Company, and the anarchists were severely persecuted. So this was entering into a period of repression and what was called pistolerismo, or rule of the gun, right? Where King Alfonso allowed General José Antonio Primo de Rivera to form a military government that ruled from 1923 to 1930 and prohibited all CNT activities. So his son would later go on to be leader of the Falange, Spanish fascists, who had the same name, actually, José Antonio Primo de Rivera. The FAI, so the FAI is a group that caucuses within the CNT, and they really gain a lot of influence in this period of underground organization, and their initial intention is to be organized around illegal activities and planning for the assassination of the Spanish monarchy. Yeah. Federación Anarquista Ibérica. So the Anarchist Federation of Iberia. And they caucus within the CNT, and they're like more of the intellectuals within the organization and propagandists. And so they show up a lot when it comes time to make important decisions and sometimes hinder the CNT from taking the next step to assert their power, interestingly enough. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what ends up happening with the FAI is, of course, it's formed in 1927 to overthrow the Spanish and Portuguese monarchies, right, and aim at coordinating violent attacks to overthrow the dictatorship and the king. But in January 1930, José Antonio Primo de Rivera resigns, and the king, Alfonso XIII, goes into exile, right? And so this brings about the Second Spanish Republic. So you might say that organizing effort was unnecessary in many regards, but what ends up happening afterwards is you see a drastic period of growth for the organization. And in the Second Republic, right, so this is after the military dictatorship and the king leaves, right, you have many anarchists perceiving the libertarian syndicalist model of the CNT as prefigurative, meaning they view it as its assemblies and its unpaid delegados as model for their vision of a future egalitarian society, right? So there's this new republic, and they're trying to organize under the Second Spanish Republic, where the government is constructed after the exile of Alfonso XIII and based upon a committee headed by a guy named Zamora, who was a Catholic landowner from Cordoba. Oh, and then, sorry, let me point out some of these images here. So this is the CNT, right, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, and then here you have the Federación Anarquista Ibérica. So this is a little conference, workers' congress. And if we could just skip to the next slide. Thank you. So on the left, you see Zamora. So he is the first prime minister and head of state of the Second Republic, right? Now, his rule is troubled by all of these social questions that have been inherited from the dictatorship, right? So you have the the legitimation of a conventional bourgeois republic. That was ultimately his goal. Of course, he fell short of that goal because there were these issues of, well, agrarian backwardness is one of them, right? So the countryside hadn't thoroughly industrialized and modernized in the same way that other European countries had in Spain. For instance, there's the region of the south of the Guadarrama Mountains, which was labeled the Latifundia Zone, where the capitalists brought up they bought up all the old large feudal estates in the 19th century. So you had 750,000 landless workers, and then you have 2,000 families that own 90% of the land. So these are the capitalists who end up buying all the land. So there's this problem of agrarian backwardness, uneven development, you might say, or combined development, right? And then you have Catalan and Basque separatism at the same time, right? And then the strained relationship between the church and the state, or the ambiguous relationship, because obviously during the monarchy and the military dictatorship, this was a very close sort of hand-in-glove relationship between the monarchy and the institution of the church. And so the Second Republic is ultimately unsuccessful as well at curtailing the influence of the military. So they have a couple missteps with this, right? So the military is by and large still ambivalent about the prospect of democracy or a bourgeois republic, right? And you might liken it to the way that the military saw the government of the SPD after the First World War, right? Where you have the military leadership is just really not feeling the whole liberal bourgeois thing. They're definitely seeing some reassignments. Some are getting demoted. For instance, you have General Sanjurjo, who is placed in charge of the Guardia Civil, which is seen as a demotion because, of course, the Guardia Civil are in charge of internal security. And so a lot of the repressive measures that you see happening in terms of like police actions are carried out by the Guardia Civil. If you've ever read, there's this one poem by Federico Garcia Lorca where he's talking about Antionito en el Camborio en el camino a Sevilla, I think, or a Córdoba. Sorry about that. But basically the idea is that there's this Romani person who's walking along the road, finds a lemon tree, makes some lemonade, drinks it, and then gets arrested for doing so. So the Guardia Civil have this sort of ominous reputation. And he's placed in charge of them, Sanjurjo, whose sympathies are sort of, well, you'll see soon enough. And they attempt to divide responsibility, try to handle this issue of this internal security force, which is still not loyal to the Republic, by creating a new branch called the Assault Guards, or Guardia de Asalto, And they give them control over the metropolitan areas, and then the civiles control over the countryside. So this is how they try to deal with these things. In the meanwhile, the way that the CNT is dealing with things and is organizing, we see a telephone strike in July of 1931. So like right after the new republic's declared, right, they're pushing their demands and starting a telephone strike. And then during the strike, a worker is killed. They have a funeral in Sevilla for this worker, which is broken up by the police, right? And so several people are killed. And in the wake of this development, we see the CNT declare open war on the government with the intention of overthrowing it. So subsequently, after this development, there's a rent struggle in Barcelona. And the CNT FAI coalition begins with the demand of a construction union in 1931 who put forward this demand for a 40% rent rollback. So pretty substantial. The Economic Defense Council claimed the participation of 100,000 people in this demonstration. Right? The PSOE and the UGT, so this is the Socialist Party of Spain, who's part of the government with the liberals. They're in coalition. They condemn the strike, and the individual landlords and landowners who are not making any money off the rent basically organize these militias, and they arrest people who've been evicted, and so they sort of try to preempt a more protracted struggle. And the results of this are kind of ambiguous. You see some people who have their rent reduced, and then you see others who don't. But what a lot of the younger members of the CNT feel like is that it's provided them with revolutionary instruction, right? It's provided them with experience where they're struggling against the state. There's also, in this period of the liberal socialist coalition, the CNT is repressed, right? And this led up to what you might call like a revolutionary adventure. There were people in the CNT who criticized it as such, but the Casas Viejas massacre, it started out as something that was kind of typical of this era, where you would have an anarchist go into a small town and would go to the town center and go to the town hall, run up the red and black flag, burn the property records, and declare libertarian communism. One of these incidents, the Casas Viejas incident, ended up with the government using excessive force and burning down a house with a whole family inside, and shooting people who had surrendered. So there was significant blowback against the government, actually. So it sort of harkens back to the old concept of propaganda of the deed, right? What they call this is revolutionary gymnastics, actually, the syndicalist who I sourced this from. But, it ultimately ended up being effective as a propaganda measure because what it allowed is for the the left wing of the PSOE, led by Largo Caballero, who was pronounced by the Soviets as the Spanish Lenin, and then they later retracted it when he wasn't quite as pliable with the PCE. He ended up getting more factional support he was able to push out the leaders of the party who were in coalition with the liberals. And this was sort of initiated by this Casas Viejas incident. But yeah, so meanwhile, there was a factional struggle that happened within the CNT. It was within the FAI ultimately. There was this group called the Treintistas, and they were decried by some of the more ardent FAI members as reformists. But their idea was that there needs to be a transitional state from capitalism to anarchism, right? So their idea is like, okay, so we have this revolutionary organization, right? And it is, voluntarist free association, right? We elect our leaders, and we have, regional delegations, national delegations, right? And this is all happening, on the basis of workers who are trying to overcome class, right? Or class contradiction, if you will. But the Trentistas think that there needs to be some political intervention, right? This gets them thrown out of the CNT. Later, they're invited back in, though. But it's interesting that you do see a sort of similar development to what happened in earlier phases of socialist history, right? Where you have this idea of a transitional state or the dictatorship of the proletariat that is administering capitalism temporarily in order to overcome it. But you see this develop within anarchism as well. So in 1933, right, there's another development. There's the SEDA coalition, so it's the right-wingers. They end up winning the election by a narrow margin with this guy named Leroux. They grant amnesty to all of the people under Sanjurjo who actually participated in an attempted coup in Sevilla. So Sanjurjo is this guy who gets reassigned to the Guardia Civil. He ends up getting, he was basically let off the hook by this new SEDA government, granted amnesty. He flees to Estoril in Portugal, which is important for when the coup actually happens. I'll just go ahead and get this out of the way. What ends up happening is he gets in his plane during the coup, and he has so much luggage on it when he's leaving Lisbon that the plane ends up crashing. So he was supposed to be like the guy who's leading the coup, and his plane crashes, which is, pretty funny. But the anarchists anticipating an imminent crackdown, they end up engaging in some insurrectionary actions, and many of them are imprisoned. So many CNT leaders are imprisoned for this reason, right? They end up supporting the left-wing coalition in the next elections for the first time. They vote en masse for the left-wingers, the socialists, basically, in the 1936 election. Meanwhile, in 1934, this is still under the right-wing government, right? The CNT and the UGT are with the socialists. They, in a very limited sense, they collaborate in Asturias, where there's a large miners' strike, and they end up taking control of the whole region for 2 weeks before it's brutally suppressed by the military. And the man they send on that assignment is none other than Francisco Franco, right? So he's the person who ends up putting down the workers' revolt in Asturias. So sort of his audition for the role of the dictator of Spain. Then the FAI, in this period, right, they can see the revolutionary actions. They can see, the miners' strike in Asturias. They can see that there are farm workers' unions that are carrying out land reform spontaneously through mass land seizures. And by 1935, the FAI ends up reconciling with the Trentistas and invites them back into the CNT in a bid for unity, because what they think is happening is they're anticipating that the masses are moving towards revolution. And then the National Congress of the CNT ends up holding this Congress in Zaragoza, where delegates put forward a positive program envisioning what a libertarian communist society would look like, right? So it's attempting to synthesize two strains, right? There's the communalist anarchist strain, where it's organized on the basis of communities. And then there's the sort of productivist, libertarian syndicalist strain of the movement, which happens in the factories. And the way that they try to synthesize these two practically in their program is they want to put forward a dual structure of government of both workplace assemblies and municipal assemblies. So it's interesting. You see this dichotomy of two different kinds of anarchism, right? You have the anarcho-syndicalist strain, and then you have the communal anarchist strain. Now, interestingly enough, we really don't have the anarcho-communal or anarcho-syndicalist strain outside of, the CNT, which has very few members nowadays. And what you do have today is this communalist strain. Now, at what I would call the high watermark of anarchist organizing, when you have, industrial society that is being organized by anarchists, you only see that trade unionist, syndicalist element being represented in the structure of government. And what I mean by that is that when they send a proposal to the PSOE, their idea of forming a government just consists of people from the CNT, so the actual trade union organization, holding seats. So 7 seats for the CNT, 7 seats for the UGT. So you only see in their proposed government representation for the syndicalist strain in practice, right? So that's an interesting development, I would say. And another thing that's missing from this is a theory of state power. If it's going to be smashed, how will this be achieved, right? So there's always this question, right? To what degree do we need to stand apart from the political? It sort of haunts their consciousness, and is, you see a little bit of that in the split with the Treintistas, because, of course, the idea is that the anarchist organizing is going to be prefigurative, and we can stand outside the state to ultimately assume responsibility for society through our civil social organizing. Oh, and let me point out these pictures here. So I already mentioned that is Zamora, the first head of state of the Second Spanish Republic. That's Sanjurjo, the guy who has the plane accident. Here we see, this is the aftermath on top of the Casas Viejas incident. And below we see the end result of the Asturias miners' strike, where they're being surrounded by soldiers. If you don't mind skipping, thank you. All right. Oh, yes. Another thing that happened in the Zaragoza Conference is that it envisioned a people's militia or an army in defense of the new social order, right? So that's another thing, is having a permanent body, special body of armed men, right? So another development, right? So when you talk about anarchist theoreticians, you have Kropotkin, right? And Kropotkin emphasized local communalist democracy over representative government because, of course, he identified the representative government with the sort of oppression that one would see in the state, where people are removed from the decision-making process, right? You also have Malatesta, who criticized syndicalism, the idea that you're going to be prefigurative in the structure of a syndicate or a union, even though, of course, he participated in, the 1905 revolutions, which were, more international. But he did so with great reservation because ultimately his understanding was that even though the ultimate aim might be anarchism, you can't say that these organizations themselves, trade unions, are going to be anarchist, because his idea is there's this issue, of course, even in the structure of a union with hierarchy, right? It bears the marks of unfreedom. So somebody like Malatesta would say, the ultimate goal is the important thing, not the means of getting there. The institutions themselves, the workers' organizations, are not prefigurative. So that's an important distinction to make. Those of the anarchists who say this is a model, and those who say it's not, right? So the left coalition, this is in the capitalist elections, right, won a slim majority of the vote count in 1936, but won a solid victory in legislative seats, right? And the CNT, like I said earlier, they vote en masse for the left coalition. Now we get to the Civil War, right? Because the Civil War is preceded by this election. This is really the casus belli of these generals. They see their influence is waning. They impend a personal crisis if they don't intervene. And after the election, you see an increase of political violence, right? So the coup is initiated by the military in response to the election results, and in July 1936, the coup begins at 5 a.m. In response, sirens immediately go off in Barcelona because the CNT has been preparing for this. They have their neighborhood defense councils, and so they mobilize 200 different groups in their defense councils who concentrate on the police stations and an army base, where they surround the army base and get a corporal to shoot his fascist officer, where they're able to seize a large supply of weapons. After this, right, after they've secured all of the forces in the city and they have the sole productive power in the city, they've organized the workplaces, they become the sole undisputed masters of the city. And Luis Companys, you can see him right here. Sorry, I'm standing in the way. You can see him on the left right here. He is the president of the Generalitat of Catalonia. And he offers to step down, to cede power to the CNT because, well, he recognizes that his situation is hopeless if he's not able to sway them in some way, right? Now, he was also a former lawyer for the CNT, so that helps him a little bit. But he does offer his resignation and his support, right? Another important thing to notice is that in instances when union members took swift action, whether it was the CNT or the UGT, against the uprising and were joined by the police, the Guardia de Asalto, the coup was defeated in most instances where that was true. In contrast, there's this one particular case in Zaragoza where the CNT trusted the liberal officials in the city, and they were all slaughtered. So in 1979, there was a mass grave that was unturned with 7,000 people, right? These were all the CNT activists who were killed because they were complacent. They didn't mobilize and try to get the Asaltos onto their side at the beginning of the uprising. Right, so yeah, Luis Companys offers to cede political power to the CNT, and the anarchists, they have a meeting, right? There's a CNT meeting, and Federica Montseny and Diego Abad de Santillan, they argue against taking power as being an anarchist dictatorship or imposing the will of the minority upon the majority, which is why they choose not to overthrow the Generalitat, right? There are others, Juan Garcia Oliver, who's depicted on the left right here, argues in favor of it, right? But he's not able to sway people. And one thing that an anarcho-syndicalist who I sourced from said is that part of this kind of results from a confusion over what's meant about prefigurative politics, right? Because not everybody agrees that these trade unions are actually prefigurative or a model for anarchist society. So even when, right, you build this organization based upon sort of anarchist principles of free association, classless society, right, you can still be accused of dictatorship, right? So thinking about it in terms of a logical progression, right? Any force that presents themselves, even if they don't, like when they don't have a majority of people, acts as a dictatorship, rather than looking at the historical progression of the society and the forces that array themselves, right? So instead, what ends up happening is the CNT joins the Popular Front Anti-Fascist Militia Committee, where they only have 3 out of the 15 seats, right? So the communists, even though they're not well organized in the city, they're able to take power basically through maneuvering and getting the CNT to join this anti-fascist militia committee. And so, yeah, they're basically, this discredits them in the future when they're trying to form a government with Largo Caballero. in August 30 on August 31st, Jose Giral, the Republican prime minister in Madrid, actually told a member of the CNT National Committee that everything is in the hands of the CNT. The CNT directs the war, but without sharing the supreme responsibilities. Govern, take power. And so on September 3rd, the CNT proposes the National Defense Council to replace the Popular Front with 15 seats. So 7 go to the CNT, 7 go to the UGT, and then Largo Caballero would be the president. The CNT, of course, they could have applied pressure by dissolving the Generalitat, right? It would have discredited the provisional government, and it would have sort of forced the issue a little bit more. But instead, right, joining the anti-fascist militia committee indicates to Caballero that they're not that serious about governing, right? That they're not interested in taking political power. So, interestingly enough, you see the CNT and the SPD fall back on a similar kind of excuse, right, of exceptional circumstances. So even though the CNT, like the CNT, the anarchists that organized within it, would say, right, we're not like the socialists. They're authoritarian. They're going to use state power, and it's ultimately going to be used against the workers, right? And of course, they don't end up taking power directly. Or, well, what they end up doing, of course, is they take power and suppress the workers' revolution, right? Now, the situation is a little different, but, of course, the anarchists ultimately don't take power because they're afraid of the revolution, potentially, right? Or afraid of the situation that it might evolve out of their control, right? So the CNT advocates social ownership. All workplaces must be grouped together in an industrial federation. So now this is just their vision, right? Responsible for managing industry, where they would be expected to adhere to social plans, where they would receive directives from below to make adjustments economically according to regional and national congresses. So this is how they plan to socialize production. Their concept is that we're going to have this economic revolution without taking state power, and we're going to do it through organizing and civil society, right? So we're going to socialize production by organizing these federations, which are taking consumer demand from the bottom up, right? And this is a social planning idea that originates with Santillán, right? And then socialization ends up being limited to larger industries because of limitations to really what was possible due to constraints in development, right? You have varying degrees of advancedness in tools, the use of tools, right? They couldn't import them because they were currently under blockade. And so you see there's this disparity between the large industries and the small industries. And so an alternate plan is offered for the smaller industries of collectivization, right? Where it was intended to be a short-term alternative for smaller industries, where workplaces and industries were run as cooperatives, right? In which they were the collective private property of the workers. So the property itself was not socialized in their view. Rather, it was collectively held within that workplace or that industry as private property. Now, this led to some, awkward circumstances. You have the example of the textile mills. According to Josep Costa, the CNT secretary of the Textile Union in Badalona, he said that the textile mills acted as autonomous units, marketing them as they liked. It was a sort of popular capitalism. So there's an open acknowledge of the limitations of the process of collectivization, because it was never a part of the CNT program before, and yet it seemed as though it was forced on them, right, by the economic situation, the political turmoil. You also see at the same time the organization of Mujeres Libres, right, free women, who were able to organize themselves independently And this resulted from the need for autonomous spaces for women to liberate themselves from what they saw as the triple enslavement of ignorance, enslavement as women, and enslavement as workers. Interestingly enough, they actually didn't use the label feminist for themselves. What they claimed was that feminism was a movement for women to gain access to elite positions in professions, management, and government. So they made an interesting distinction there. Then the CNT, UGT, textile, industrial adopted a proposal. Sorry, this is switching back to the economic plan. Wanted to go over briefly some of the social transformations that were happening. A resolution for a broad socialization of the economy to correct the errors of collectivization, but it ultimately never panned out, and there's a reason for that, right? Basically, the Generalitat controlled the foreign credit system, right? Remember how they didn't abolish the Generalitat? Well, now their access to foreign credit depends on this government structure that they've left in place and now can't get rid of. And that anti-fascist council that could potentially control the Generalitat is coming under more communist influence, right? So now you see the economic prospects of the CNT, who envisioned a purely economic revolution, being thwarted by the political, hegemony of the communists who ended up taking initiative by going directly for political state power, right? So what you see is that on the one hand, you have a purely economic civil social revolution, right, or attempt at a revolution that is limited because it's insufficiently political. And then you also see another social force, the PCE, who are directed by Stalin, who are explicitly using exclusively political means, making their appeal to the middle class, not to the workers, right? This is made very explicit. Their appeal is directly to the middle class to prevent the revolution, right? So a sole focus on the political or a sole focus on the social economic leads to capitalist politics ultimately by way of fascism. But right. So this raises the question, right? Now we're going to get into the Q&A. Could be a more general discussion as well. Was the fatal flaw limitation to the trade union struggle, right? What Trotsky's critique is that ultimately the CNT should have formed Soviets, or workers' committees, if you will, workers' councils that invited people from the community and from the workplace, so there wasn't this strict dichotomy of communalism and syndicalism, right? To take leadership of the revolution as a new revolutionary government and to form a party. This is something he also criticizes the POUM for, which we didn't spend a lot of time on, unfortunately, but if you have questions, we could talk about that. Yeah, and the CNT had two opportunities to take power, July 20th of 1936 and May 1937. In May 1937, the CNT and the FAI leadership saved the leadership of the Popular Front. Did the desire to strictly abstain from political action save the bourgeoisie and its politics, proving itself to be either reformist or counter-revolutionary? The anti-political strain, right, or focus, is a core tenet of one's ideology. Does that lead directly back to capitalist politics? Oh, sorry, let me turn on the... Is it this one? Hello? Yeah, questions. I'll give it to Drew first.
Okay. I think this was like the defeat of the CNT was already kind of spelled out by the refusal to take. All right, partially it might have been spelled out by the refusal to take power, but just to get like the full timeline here, how did the Spanish Civil War end? How did the CNT manage to get swept under? Right.
That's a good question. So the CNT holds on to seats in the cabinet of the anti-fascist government until pretty close to the end. There's a pretty gruesome incident where you have basically anarchists appointed as heads of prisons, right? And so they're complying with some of the Stalinist secret police at the GPU, right? And so they're sort of orchestrating that. In terms of the timeline about how long they held on to power, right? That part not 100% sure about. Of course, Catalonia ultimately falls to the nationalists, as does the rest of Spain. And interestingly enough, Catalan is banned from being spoken in public under the dictatorship. And the CNT itself is outlawed until the dictatorship ends.
So I had a couple questions. First, I wanted to get a sense of what drew you to the topic. So why this period? Why is this interesting? Why did you choose the Spanish Civil War? The second was your discussion on. I've never heard of this before, so maybe if you could talk about it more. I think it was it was earlier on the FAI group, Trunquistas. How do I say this?
Treintistas, the 30, because there are 30 signatories to their letter that they end up sending to the FAI.
Well, this idea of them discovering the need for a transitional state, my sense is that the most provocative kind of formulation of Marxism or Lenin is the necessity of the transitional state being a political kind of task, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that the anarchists are sort of supposedly discovering this but don't have like a political conception, how could it seems very contradictory to recognize its necessity, but then also not rise to the task and then just walk away not just walking away, but really it feels like, we just can't take political power, but then also recognizing the necessity of the transitional state. So those two things, I was wondering.
Right. One gets the sense out of the Treintistas that there's this sort of spontaneous ambition to form a party, right? That what's necessary is to take and hold state power for the purpose of transitioning to their envisioned society, because what they see is the inability to do that through the means of the existing structures, whether it be through the union organizations or the state as it is, right? And so this is actually called, as I said earlier, reformist by the FAI. Their idea is that you need to go straight to anarchism. We have something similar now where people call themselves communizers, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's a similar sort of idea. And then the interest in the topic really comes from what I get as a sense that there's a need for civil social organizing in the present. And if this is the case, can we understand what the limitations to that civil social organizing might be, right? What are the ends of this, first of all, right? What negative lessons might we take from those who've achieved a great deal of civil social organization, but were not able to make the revolution? So that was my interest.
This is coming from a place of very little knowledge of anarchism. But in that basis of knowledge was the idea that what delineated communism from anarchism was the lack of a transitional program. So anarchism with a transitional program, what is that?
Right.
Sorry.
It's an interesting question because ultimately the objectives are quite similar, a classless, stateless, moneyless society. They tried the moneyless thing, actually, and it was premature. There is an anarchist who made a critique of a small village that tried to abolish money. They ended up going to labor vouchers, but they're like, no, they didn't even go to labor vouchers. They just had like this sort of communal space where they would trade goods. And it led to things like, an excess of waste, right? And so they were like, well, maybe we do need some sort of way of tokenizing labor time, right? So it the ultimate objectives are the same: classless, stateless, moneyless society. But the question is, can you simply do away with the state without, administering away the state, right? Substituting the administration of things for the administration of people, so to speak. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that I'm not sure. It seems a lot like Marxism, right? The necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat is something that they happened upon spontaneously, just through gaining trade union consciousness and recognizing the limitations of that, right? But can we recognize the limitation of that if socialism's not on the table ideologically? That's another important question.
Could you speak a little bit more about the Generalitat and how it came to be taken over by socialists that you described? I'm kind of curious because there's a lot of people who bemoan the lack of solidarity and leftist struggle during the Civil War, right? The fact that the anarchists had to fight the socialists. So why exactly did the socialists refuse to help to the CNT? And as you said, how did they first come to take over power in it?
Yeah.
And then why did they refuse the help through credit and other political systems?
Well, it's an interesting thing because there are two different, there are a bunch of different forces within the Spanish state, right? You have the PSOE, who are like social democrat kind of, moderate socialists. They come, like the PSOE is still a party in Spain, right? But of course, in this period under Largo Caballero, who, of course, is deemed the Spanish Lenin, later retracted, the communists see him as useful. By the communists, I mean the Third International, so Stalin. And interestingly enough, right, they do a deal with the central government, gold in exchange for weapons, right? But then they end up getting political power too, right? So they're able to operate with their secret police inside of Spain. And they gain a lot of influence. They force all the officers in the military to carry party cards for the Spanish Communist Party. And so the CNT is seen as sort of a loose cannon, right? They're a liability within the Republican government. And so there's a lack of solidarity because there's a difference in ends. Now, this is actually a really important question, right? Because there is a desire from the Stalinist foreign policy to repress a social revolution in Spain, right? And this is made explicit. They're trying to organize amongst middle-class people who are anxious about the prospect of revolution. Only 40% of the membership of the Spanish Communist Party are actually working class, right? So this is intentional, right? And the purpose is to keep the lid on a potential revolution in Spain. The reason for this is geopolitical. They are trying to seek mutual defense pacts with England and France at the time. The Soviet Union is. And so if it looks like they're midwifing a revolution, then they're going to jeopardize their security guarantees, which will leave them vulnerable against the Nazis. And they're also not trying to piss off the Nazis too much, because if things fall through with the Allies, then they're like, okay, we'll deal with Hitler, right? So they're trying to sort of keep their hands clean of exporting revolution, right? And to do so, they're willing to suppress the revolutionary forces in Spain.
I was under the impression that Stalin was the only one supporting the Republicans during the war.
In terms of state powers, yes. Interestingly enough, Mexico does send some guns. But Stalin is, yes, he is the power nominally supporting the Republican government, but the point that Trotsky makes is nobody supported the Soviet Union when it was invaded by a bunch of different foreign powers, and they were able to make it work because they had the advantage of building a revolution in the country. Whereas with the Stalinists, you had all the forms, right? You had political commissars that were attached to the military, right? You allegedly had this party apparatus, which was in the minds of these people, they were going to struggle for revolution, but the democratic revolution just had to be achieved first, which is why they organize with the bourgeoisie's shadow, because the majority of them go over to Franco. The people they're allying with are like the parts of the bourgeoisie who make up the state bureaucrats, like the new middle class, right? And then various lawyers and stuff who have, you know, bourgeois political horizons, right? But ultimately, you know, they're very useful for Stalin because they allow him to maintain this impression of international legitimacy. Mm-hmm.
I had another question about the, I guess the like on the ground style of the CNT, right? Like I read in one of the things that at one point the CNT's membership was higher than that of the UGT, the union that was affiliated to the regular Socialist Party, right? So what were the things that made the CNT legitimate in the eyes of people? Why was it that an anarchist could go into a village, burn the property records, and people would be like, "Oh, that's great, that's fine." Like, what was the kind of, I guess, the phenomena of the CNT?
I've thought about this a lot, and it's not something I can find a clear answer to. Why are the anarchists so successful in Spain but not very successful elsewhere? It's a really important question. And even, you know, as trade unionists nonetheless, right? So they're able to do both things. They're able to be these like adventurous revolutionaries. You have anarchists out in the hills of Andalusia in the south, right? In addition to Catalonia, right? So what I think is you have this legacy of extreme sort of the use of religion, right, is one of them as an institution of the state. And the anarchist concept is that you have liberated people who are not subject to the authority, whether that be religious or, cultural, right? And both the state and the church represent something that's both very religious, very cultural. So it seems like the antithesis of that is this kind of anarchism, which is civil social, right? And also very individualistic, very liberatory. As far as like the cultural reasons for its success, I think that's my answer. I don't know. Somebody else might have a better one.
That was so much louder than I thought it would be. Sorry. Yeah, I was reading a little bit about this before the teach-in, and I guess is pretty much in accordance with what you were saying. But there was this one interesting part that I wanted to add on. But here, one important thing must be noted. This Spanish anarchism was based on a mere popular instinct, which was both its strength and its weakness. Its strength because the great popular movement was not the fruit of abstract discussions or of theories cultivated by a few intellectuals, but of a social dynamism of a sometimes truly volcanic power whose libertarian content could always count on the sympathies of hundreds of thousands or even millions of the country's inhabitants. Let me find the part about the weakness. But its shortcomings were to be shown at the moment when this movement had to build, after 3/4 of a century of destructive struggle, of pure criticism and protest, at the moment when a considerable part of the responsibility for the fate of a whole country and the victory or failure in a totally unexpected war fell on this movement. So I guess it's kind of like saying that while in other countries when Marxism spread, it was because of a fascination with like a specific ideology and being gripped by the works of specific thinkers. This was more capitalizing on a sentiment that already existed among people, but in a way it's harder to get people like involved in real revolutionary action and being able to risk their lives in a decisive, controlled, and premeditated way over something that they just kind of feel. rather than being able to cite like a specific text that made them come to that conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's really good. It's interesting. You see in the sort of merger theory this idea of the intellectuals and the workers being united in the form of the party, right? But in the Spanish anarchist movement, one gets the sense that the intellectuals, they exist, right? But the workers themselves contain, in their own practice, some sort of theoretical experience.
I find it kind of interesting you stopped where you did, right? Like before most of the war from the government side and Franco's crushing of it, right?
Yeah.
Is there a reason that you chose that? I mean, I know you're trying to center this refusal to take political power by the CNT. What do you think might have gone differently after that point had they done so?
Yeah, I think the reason why I didn't include so many details about the war itself is just... Sorry about that. The reason why I didn't include as many details about the war itself, I think, is just, I'm not sure what political lessons we can learn from it. There are some instances... So Trotsky has this interesting point, right? That all of the personnel that you would need to achieve victory, like all of the military scientists who were trained at the Lenin Institute in Moscow, right, that you would need to do the revolution, like the expertise, the equipment, all this stuff was present. But the lacking thing was the impetus for social revolution, right? So in my presentation, what I wanted to focus on is why were they unable to build the social revolution, right? Because I think that was the decisive factor in the failure of the Republicans in the Civil War. So that's why I didn't go into the details about like the Battle of Teruel, right, which was where the Republicans tried to build a counteroffensive, but they took the city, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. And then, there was the Battle of the Ebro, where the nationalists puncture through and get across the river, which leaves the rest of Catalonia exposed, so they can sort of advance. Yeah, I mean, all of that just gets into military history, and then we're like World War II dads. We're like looking at the tanks. We're like, oh, cool, look, those are early version Russian tanks, and it's like a prototype of the later ones that they bring out during World War II. But no, apparently during the Battle of Madrid, those tanks were like hot stoves because you're out in the middle of the sun in this arid climate, and you're trying to... the tanks, actually, this is an interesting point, are used as support for infantry rather than made into their own divisions, their own columns, which was the German tactic in World War II, where they were able to puncture through front lines using a whole division of tanks, right, by combining them for sort of force aggregation. And they hadn't developed this tactic yet on the Republican side.
I've got one more question, if no one else does, and I wanted to know a little bit about the main thrust that as you said, the main reason you wanted to look at this was to understand the limits of social organizing, right? So how can we take that forward today? How can we use it to understand social civil organizing? Is the only lesson that state power is required, that there's a limit to what you call economism, even in something like anarcho-syndicalism? What can it help us in rebuilding a movement today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main takeaway that I got, and feel free somebody else to chime in if you interpreted this differently. My main takeaway is that a focus either on the political, as I mentioned with the Stalinists, or with the economic leads eventually back into capitalist politics if one doesn't make some kind of political intervention. And that is a real crisis, the question of how power ought to be seized, right? And what really constitutes the dictatorship of the proletariat. The lesson there is just there is a crisis of trying to substitute oneself for the state in a way that doesn't make that force the inheritor state, merely inheriting the bourgeois state, right? But simply standing outside of society, outside of the state in civil society also has its dangers, right?
Another question I had was, how, like, I know Caballero was like, I guess, head of the UGT that eventually turned into like a pseudo revolutionary organization as well, right? So I was wondering, I think, and they kind of dropped out of the narrative that you presented when the Popular Defense Council was established, right? So did the UGT and the PSOE maintain its sort of revolutionary inclination, or did it also fall under the lines of Popular Front politics against Franco and his militia?
Caballero is also a victim of the Popular Front. He is replaced with a guy named Juan Negrin, who's more pliable with Stalin, allows him to basically go after the leaders of the POUM, which I didn't talk about as much, but they're a combination of the left and the right opposition, right? So the people who see themselves as Trotskyist and the people who see themselves as Bukharinists, they sort of merge together, interestingly enough, and they're the opposition. They're the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. I've wondered this, and I think it comes down to a question of tactics, like how they're going to organize the peasantry. Now, Trotsky calls them centrist, but it's not just like their political ideology that he calls them centrist about. It's this idea that they're going to organize outside of the major unions, like the UGT and the CNT, and attempt to not step on anybody's toes, and outside of the regular army where they can't organize officers and soldiers, right? So they can't form Soviets if they can't do those things. So they created their own independent union and their own independent militia, which they're sort of like sitting ducks waiting for the Stalinists to come find them. And interestingly enough, so you know how there's homage to Catalonia? That's Orwell's book. He's trying to get transferred into the international brigades. And then the May 1937 demonstrations happen where the CNT tries to go in and overthrow the government again, and then the leadership's like, no guys, disarm. And so he participates in that, and then sort of sees the aftermath where when they voluntarily disarm, well, a lot of the POUM gets killed. André Onin ends up being assassinated. He gets shot by the GPU. He's the leader of the POUM. He was formerly Trotsky's secretary, and then Trotsky ends up denouncing the POUM.
Sorry. An interesting, well, all of it's interesting, but a point that I think you keep touching on is this idea of, is this structure premeditated? Is this supposed to be a model for what it will look like under anarchism or not? And I think it's really interesting when the CNT is put in a position where they can take power and they voluntarily choose not to, because they're, if in theory they're fundamentally opposed to minority opinion taking precedent over the majority, they don't want to do that in practice, which makes sense ideologically, but historically I think played out rather poorly and is kind of seen as like a missed opportunity. So I don't know, I think it's just like an interesting point of discussion, which is if your whole basis is anti-hierarchical and you're forced in a position where it's either be hierarchical or lose the revolutionary momentum, you know, what can you really do in that no-win scenario?
Some people here read The Mass Strike by Rosa Luxemburg, right? And the idea is that you're never going to organize the majority. Right? You're never going to get the majority of people on your side. You might have the plurality, but you can create the majority through action, right? And it seems like there was the opportunity to create the majority, and it was unrecognized by the leadership, right? So they saw what existed at the time, and they were hamstrung by the idea of society as it was, not as it could be.
So you have sort of placed like these people wanted to do things politically, these people economically, blah blah blah. I guess from a modern perspective, it's very hard to separate these categories. So I was wondering, how are people at the time, like the anarchists who were discussing, conceptualizing the state, like the state as something that is like separate from the rest of society, that sort of stands outside of it, or is it within this sort of matrix of things, how we kind of see it sociologically today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In terms of the state, am I on? Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I would say that there are certain anarchists for whom the idea of what originates, right, the other, or what precedes the other, is it class contradiction that necessitates the state, or is the state producing class contradiction, class society, right? And I think a lot of the hang-ups about should we act, are we merely being the state, right, comes from this idea that the state is actually like causing all of these problems, not that it's symptomatic or necessitated by class, right? And so that's why I think that is a fundamental problem that I see when, you know, for instance, you have these people like Monsanto who says that you are going to impose the will of the minority upon the majority and constitute a dictatorship that way. Yeah, sorry about that. That you're going to constitute a dictatorship by imposing the will of the minority on the majority, which sees the state as a problem of form rather than a problem of a historical process.
So I hesitated to ask because you may have already discussed this in depth, and I'm not sure. So sorry for showing up late. But on this topic of like what it was in terms of either like the popular imagination or what made Spanish, say, like workers or just people more ready to accept like the CNT walking in and just burning property records or whatever. We talk a lot about sort of like the miscarriage of revolution in 1917 and it being kind of reflected and occurring in a perverted form in the 30s in, say, Germany. And I wonder, and so that period is in living memory for people here. Maybe not like the 16-year-old kids who go up and join, go up to the front or something. But in what way is the kind of, first of all, I don't know anything about what was going on in Spain at that time, but also what was going on in Spain at that time, and how was that experience kind of reflected and made sense of up until this moment?
In 1917?
Yeah.
How it affected the Spanish? Yeah, I mean, you have this idea that I think because of the distance, there might be some misunderstandings about what the Russian Revolution really was. You get the sense from like Largo Caballero that his idea is like, we're going to be like the Bolsheviks and that we're going to like nationalize everything and we're going to centralize power, all of this stuff, right? So it's possible that they learned some of the wrong lessons, but it certainly is true that it's spurring the militancy of the Spanish left, and it's pushing them in a direction where they have no choice but to seize power, right? Now, is it actually allowing them to construct a party, like a revolutionary party like the Bolsheviks? Oh, got a mouse in the house. But, oh yeah, the party question, right? The failure is to organize the party, right? Or you might see it from that perspective. You need you need some sort of organization that's capable of interfacing the workers and the intellectuals, the economic and the political, right? And so you see the lessons of 1848 again, right? And not just 1917, right? You have this perpetual crisis of needing to repeat the democratic revolution as the only possible revolutionary form, or the bourgeois revolution, sorry, as the only possible revolutionary form, but the inability to do so unless it's part of a process of a proletarian revolution as well, right? The social character has to be there for it to be transformational. Otherwise, what you get is this sort of hollow second republic, which is riddled with all of these crises because you have these contending social forces.
With regards to kind of what you said about interfacing the economic and the political, you kind of at the beginning of the presentation couched the refusal of the CNT to take state power as a failure of revolutionary leadership a la Trotsky, right? But my question is, what were the kind of internal democratic structures of the CNT and the FAI that resulted in this decision, right? Was the decision not to take power more a thing of like the executive committee or whatever the analog is, or was it the rank and file of the CNT, all the like the million in the towns that said, no, we want to continue being provincial, being like communalist, commune city, rather than taking state power. So where did it come from? How was it structured?
So the way that the structure, right? You have these delegates, and the delegates they go to form assemblies, right? And the assemblies are organized at the municipal, the regional, and then the national level. In terms of the decision-making process, what happens is that they have meetings of their local assemblies, right? And in the case of the inability to see, or the decision not to take state power, or not to dissolve the Generalitat, which is what that would have amounted to, right? Is the result of a particular vote. I have it in my notes somewhere, but it happens right after they receive the letter from Luis Companys, and they invite basically a bunch of different delegates to vote on this idea. Now, what Juan Garcia Oliver says is that they did not have enough time to deliberate, and that the FAI, Santillan and Montseny, those particular individuals from the FAI, were making this argument about the idea of a dictatorship of minority. And Oliver makes this observation that he sees there are some like younger delegates who are trying to whip the votes in a particular direction. So it's like a process that's kind of forced through, is what he's kind of implying. But that's basically how this happens. Now, this might just be trauma from an anarcho-syndicalist who's like, they could have made the revolution if not for the FAIists, right? But that was the story. Sorry, I can't see past this.
I have a quick question. It's kind of, it feels almost a little maybe adjacent to the presentation, but I remember earlier, I did show up half an hour late, so who knows, maybe I missed some context. But earlier you kind of mentioned how there was like the radical feminist movement, or a feminist movement, and they were like arguing against it, and
they didn't see themselves as feminist.
Yes, thank you. They didn't see themselves as feminist because they said that like feminism is working within the bourgeois state and trying to like just position themselves at a point of power. This kind of reminds me of something that Rosa Luxemburg said, of like how if you're like the bourgeois feminist is kind of like a parasite of the proletariat, And I'm kind of wondering, is this like kind of pointing towards this larger, like, like this about the same time, right? So is this kind of like a, I don't know if you know, like a larger trend throughout like Europe of like this view of feminism of being like anti-left or anti-communist or anti-anarchist or whatever, like pro-bourgeois, pro-state?
Yeah, I think it's the idea of like, well, what takes priority in terms of what they see as being the primary political crisis that needs to be addressed. Really sort of reflecting a class sensibility or even like which sort of movement that they're a part of, because one could easily get the sense that feminism is a competing movement and the class basis for it is petty bourgeois, right? And I think that's what the Mujeres Libres are feeling, is that, yes, women's liberation is necessary, but is it going to happen solely on the basis of femininity, right? Being a woman? Because don't we also see a lot of middle class and bourgeois women who don't really seem to have the same problems, right? Or it's expressed entirely differently, where it's like almost alien. And these are the people who identify as feminists. So I think that's probably where they're coming from.
Okay, I think we should give a round of applause for Jack for giving a great teaching. Thank you so much. We have plans to go get drinks at Shore's Diner with our friends from Irvine after this. Shore's, do we want Shore's? We think it might be open this time around? Yeah, worth another try? Yeah, we'll check. So plan to join us there if you're interested in continuing this conversation, and thank you for coming.